Midnight. A hillside in central Korea, April 1951. Below, in the dark, a sound that isn't wind. Whistles, bugles, thousands of footsteps moving together through the valley floor, and somewhere in that noise, retreating South Korean soldiers are running past Australian positions with Chinese troops mixed in among them, so close in the dark that for a moment no one can tell friend from enemy. Then the first wave hits. 700 men of the 3rd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, are dug into a hill they've held for less than a day. Above them, on paper, is a Chinese division. 20,000 men. No one on that hillside needs the exact number. They can hear it. There will be no retreat ordered tonight. There is nowhere to retreat to. Seoul is behind them, and if this hill falls, the road to the capital falls with it. This is the Battle of Kapyong. To understand why 700 Australians ended up holding a hill against odds that shouldn't have been survivable, you have to go back to the shape of the war itself in the spring of 1951. By April, the fighting in Korea had swung twice already, south to the tip of the peninsula, north almost to the Chinese border, and now south again, after China's entry into the war had pushed the United Nations line back below Seoul. By March, UN forces had clawed the capital back and were pushing north once more, part of a grinding, methodical advance that had, for weeks, felt like it might hold. Then, in the 3rd week of April, intelligence started picking up the signs of something bigger, Chinese forces massing, a spring offensive aimed squarely at retaking Seoul before the advance could consolidate. When it came, on the 22nd of April, it came in numbers that dwarfed anything the UN line had faced in months. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops moving on a broad front, smashing through South Korean divisions, defending the approaches to the capital. One of those approaches ran straight down the Kapyong Valley, and the only thing standing in that valley, hastily thrown into position with barely a day to dig in, was the 27th British Commonwealth Brigade, a scratch formation of Australian, Canadian, British, and New Zealand units that had already been in near-continuous combat for 7 months, and were, at that exact moment, expecting to be pulled back for rest. There would be no rest. There was, instead, a hill. The valley was too wide for the brigade to hold, in any conventional sense. There simply weren't enough men. The brigade's commander made the only decision available. Forward battalions would take the high ground overlooking the valley floor and hope the terrain did what the numbers couldn't. 3 RAR, the Australians, took Hill 504 on the eastern side of the valley. Roughly 4 kilometers to the west, on Hill 677, dug in the 2nd Battalion, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. Between and around them, a scattering of American tanks, a Middlesex Regiment battalion, and, critically, the guns of the 16th Field Regiment, Royal New Zealand Artillery. Each of the 2 forward battalions numbered around 700 men. Between them and Seoul, once the South Korean units broke, would be a Chinese divisional strength force. Later estimates put its committed strength at roughly 20,000 men. The maths was not subtle. It was somewhere close to 30-1 on some parts of that line, and everyone digging trenches into the cold Korean hillside that afternoon understood it without needing to be told. There was no time to build a proper defensive network. Weapons pits were scraped into rocky ground in a matter of hours. Fields of fire were sighted from memory and instinct rather than survey. Ammunition was distributed as fast as it could be carried up the slope, and as the light started to fail on the 23rd of April, word came down the line that South Korean forces to the north had broken, and that the retreat, with the enemy mixed directly into it, was already coming down the valley toward them. Most of the men digging in on Hill 504 that afternoon were not fresh troops. 3 RAR had landed at Busan the previous September and had spent the months since grinding north with the UN advance, then falling back south again when China entered the war in force, then advancing north once more through the early months of 1951. 7 months of a war that kept reversing direction under them. They knew what a Chinese offensive looked like before this one started, because they had already been on the losing end of one, months earlier, further north. That memory did not make the odds at Kapyong feel any better. If anything, it sharpened exactly how bad the maths was, because these were men who had seen what happened to units that got caught in the open when a Chinese division came on at full strength. The cold mattered too. April in the Korean hills was not gentle. Nights still dropped close to freezing, and men who had been digging since midday were doing it in damp uniforms, with sweat turning cold the moment they stopped moving. Water was scarce on the high ground. Rations were whatever had been carried up personally, because there was no time or transport for anything more organized. Every man on that hill understood, in the most literal sense, that whatever he had on his back and in his webbing that evening was what he would fight the night with. The evening of the 23rd began with chaos before it began with combat. Retreating South Korean soldiers streamed past and through the Australian position in the dark, disorganized, exhausted, and Chinese troops came with them, close enough in the confusion that a platoon of American tanks supporting 3 RAR was overrun before the battalion had fired its first deliberate shot of the battle. Then, close to midnight, the shape of the night changed. 2 full Chinese battalions struck B and C companies directly. What followed was not a single battle so much as a continuous, rolling collision that didn't stop until well past dawn. Wave after wave of Chinese infantry pressing the same ground, climbing over their own dead and wounded to keep coming, testing every meter of the Australian line for a gap. They found one. A third Chinese battalion swung wide around the exposed flank and struck battalion headquarters directly, down in the low ground near the river ford. The headquarters position, lightly held and never designed to withstand a battalion-strength assault, was forced back. For a time, contact with the forward companies was lost entirely. Higher command, working from the last reports before the line went dark, began to consider the battalion overrun. It wasn't. Up on the hill, in trenches barely deep enough to kneel in, the men of B and C companies kept fighting through a night that offered no clear front line, because the enemy wasn't only in front of them anymore. Grenades went over parapets by feel in the dark. Positions traded hands in minutes and were retaken in minutes more. There was no possibility of resupply, no possibility of relief, and for long stretches of that night, no way of knowing whether the position to your left was still held by your own side or not. The noise alone was its own kind of exhausting. Bugles and whistles carried across the valley in waves, a deliberate Chinese tactic meant to signal attacks and disorient defenders in equal measure, and beneath it, the constant, close crack of small arms fire, the flat thump of grenades in confined trench lines, and, worst, for men trying to hold a position through darkness, the sound of movement they couldn't see and couldn't identify as friend or enemy until it was almost on top of them. Ammunition belts ran hot. Rifle barrels needed to be felt rather than looked at to judge how much more they could take before the next magazine went in. Hands that had been steady at dusk were, by 3 in the morning, working entirely on muscle memory, because conscious thought had narrowed down to the next 5 meters of trench and nothing beyond it. Daylight on the 24th didn't bring relief. It brought visibility for both sides. At first light, Major Benno Dowd's A Company discovered that Chinese troops had infiltrated directly into its position overnight, dug in among their own weapon pits. A close-quarters counterattack, fought at grenade and bayonet range, drove them back out. Nearby, B Company, which had spent the night holding a hill near the river, found Chinese soldiers occupying old bunkers on a small knoll within their own perimeter and cleared them the same way, hand to hand, in trenches too cramped for anything else. Captain Reg Saunders' C Company, positioned to reinforce wherever the line buckled next, moved through the day doing exactly that. A company held in reserve not because the fighting had eased, but because every other company needed somewhere to fall back on if their ground gave way. By mid-morning, New Zealand gunners of the 16th Field Regiment were firing directly onto the slopes below the Australian positions. Close support, danger close in places, because the alternative was letting Chinese formations mass unmolested in the open ground before the next assault. It bought time. It did not change the numbers. By midday, a second Chinese regiment was identified moving to join the assault, and 3 RAR's position, now threatened with encirclement on a hill it no longer had the strength to hold indefinitely, reached the point where holding on longer meant losing the battalion rather than the ground. By this point, the toll was visible in ways that went beyond the map. A company alone had suffered close to 50 casualties who could not be evacuated, men lying in shallow trenches with wounds that needed proper medical attention nobody on that hill could give them. Field dressings ran out. There were no spare blankets to keep the wounded from the cold once the sun went down again, and every company commander on the hill was doing the same arithmetic. How many effective rifles were left? How much ammunition remained per man? And how many more hours the position could realistically be held before holding it stopped being possible at all? Lieutenant Colonel Bruce Ferguson gave the order that no defending commander wants to give, and every one of them has to be ready to withdraw in contact, under fire, down a ridgeline back toward the valley floor. A fighting withdrawal is not a retreat in the way the word is usually used. It is one of the most dangerous maneuvers in infantry combat. Every rearward step has to be covered by someone still facing the enemy. Every position has to be given up in a sequence precise enough that the whole line doesn't collapse into a rout the moment contact is broken. Down an exposed ridge with wounded who couldn't be left behind and ammunition running thin, 3 RAR fought its way off hill, 504 company by company, covering each other's movement across ground with no natural protection from observation or fire. They made it, battered, short of ammunition, carrying their casualties. The battalion came off the ridge and rejoined the rest of the Commonwealth Brigade late in the day on the 24th, a fighting withdrawal that held together under exactly the kind of pressure that breaks units apart. To the west, on Hill 677, the Canadians were now the focus of the Chinese effort. 2 PPCLI held through a second brutal night, at one point resupplied by an emergency airdrop when the position was fully surrounded and no road remained open. By the afternoon of the 25th, the road through to the Canadian position had been cleared, and the Chinese, after 2 nights of losses against ground they could not take, broke off the attempt to force the valley. The offensive on this stretch of front was over. 32 Australians were killed at Kapyong. 59 were wounded. 3 were taken prisoner, among them a young dispatch rider, alone on a motorcycle on a muddy track, cut down by small arms fire in the confusion of that first night. Against those losses, a Chinese division strength thrust, one of the main axes of an offensive built around retaking Seoul, was stopped in the Kapyong Valley by 2 underweight infantry battalions and the guns that supported them. Historians have since credited the stand at Kapyong alongside the parallel defense further west along the Imjin River, with breaking the momentum of the entire Chinese Spring offensive. Seoul did not fall. It would not change hands again for the rest of the war. Both 3 RAR and 2 PPCLI were awarded the United States Presidential Unit Citation, an honor rarely given to foreign units, for the actions of those 3 days. 3 RAR carries the battle honor Kapyong on its colors to this day, and the nickname earned in the aftermath, Old Faithful, has followed the battalion through every conflict it has fought since. There is no dramatic wreckage left at Kapyong today. The valley has long since returned to farmland. The hill, just another rise in a quiet stretch of countryside 60 kilometers from Seoul. But on the night of the 23rd of April, 1951, 700 Australians dug into that hillside with a division's worth of Chinese infantry coming at them out of the dark, no realistic hope of reinforcement, and a road to a capital city sitting directly behind their backs. They did not hold because the odds favored them. They held because the alternative was not something any of them were willing to accept. The road to Seoul stayed closed, and for decades afterward, most of the world never learned how close it had come to opening. This is the Battle of Kapyong. The hill, 700 men, held because 20,000 wasn't enough to take it from them. Subscribe for more untold stories of the men who did what everyone else said was impossible.